I'd like to talk to you about the value of one particular source in helping us to recover the history of the intertestamental period. It's not a literary source, rather it's one that's very tactile and hands-on, you might say. It's biblical archaeology. An example of the value of biblical archaeology in helping us to recover the intertestamental period was the discovery in the 1960s of the Pool of Bethesda on the northeast corner of the ancient Temple Mount. That discovery proved that there was indeed an historical tradition underlying the fourth gospel, which, even though it is independent of the synoptic gospels, is no less credible. Let me remind you, if I may, of what John says about the Pool of Bethesda in the 5th chapter of the fourth gospel. John chapter 5, verse 2. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Hebrew called Bethsatha, which has 5 porches. And in these lay a multitude of invalids, the blind, the lame, the withered. There was a man there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew that he had been lying there for a long time, he said to him, "Do you wish to be made whole?" The man answered, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is troubled, and while I am going down, another steps in before me." And Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your pallet and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his pallet and walked. That's a very specific description of a very specific place that John seems to assume that his audience would know and would understand. The problem is that there is nothing in the literature of the period, nothing in antiquity, which would validate or verify John's description of that pool being there. As a result, scholars scoffed at the claim that such a pool even existed. Intriguingly, John's description of the pool is quite specific. Listen to it again. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate or the sheep market a pool called in Hebrew Bethsatha, or as we would say Bethesda, having 5 porches. Now that's a very specific description. It's a little like saying today, on the corner next to the post office there's a McDonald's. Presumably anybody living in Jerusalem at the time would have known immediately the place of which John was speaking. But the problem is nothing in the ancient literature of the intertestamental period documented that such a pool existed. No other ancient writer ever mentions the pool. There is no evidence of any pentagonal, 5-sided pool or building which would have met the description John sets forth in John chapter 5 of this pool at which a man who had been crippled for 38 years encounters Jesus one day and is healed. And so consequently John's credibility was suspect, and his historical reliability was called into question. And yet his description is so specific that he seems to assume that everybody reading his gospel would know exactly what pool he was talking about. Well, now we know they would have, thanks to biblical archaeology. John's mention of the sheep gate is precise. Actually, the Greek says, now there is in Jerusalem at the sheep a pool. It doesn't say sheep gate or sheep market. In the Greek, it is in ti provatiki. It's the dative case for the word sheep. Provatiki is the word for sheep. This happens to be in the dative case, and it's used as a substantival adjective. Literally, it says at the sheep. And we're left to assume whether that's a sheep gate or a sheep market or some other noun for which sheep is a descriptor. But presumably, John didn't need to make it more clear than that, because anybody living in Jerusalem at the time would have known, John believes, what "at the sheep" referred to. A reasonable hypothesis was that the reference was either to a sheep gate, a gate around the old city leading outside the confines of Jerusalem to Greater Jerusalem. That's how the Revised Standard Version translates it. Or to a sheep market, which is how the King James Version translates it. More likely is that both were intended, in that a gate leading outside the city was referred to, which lay just beyond a sheep market, which would have come to be known in the first century as the sheep gate. It is the gate closest to the sheep market. Having guided in Jerusalem for years, locals tell me that up until recently, within the last 50 years or so, there was in that area, in that very area, a sheep market that was active and functioning up until modern times. Indeed, a sheep gate is mentioned in the Old Testament, particularly in an Old Testament writing from the prophet Nehemiah, who built the wall around the ancient city, Nehemiah chapter 3, and then again in Nehemiah chapter 12, in which he describes in those passages, situated on the north part of the wall, a gate, very much like John had described. The pool near the sheep gate is called, John says, Bethesda. In Hebrew, Bethesda, literally Bet Zatha, means the house of pouring. Beit in Hebrew means house. And so by extension, a house of pouring, one presumes water, would be a pool. The existence of a pool called Bethesda in the city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus has now been confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the famous copper scroll discovered at Khirbet Qumran, written sometime prior to AD 68, there is a list of places in Jerusalem. Among them is this one. Let me quote from that copper scroll. At Bethesda, in Hebrew, Beit Eshdathayin, in the pool where you enter its smaller reservoir or smaller pool. Now that's the quote from the copper scroll. What is even more striking about the copper scroll's reference to Bethesda is its spelling. It uses the Hebrew dual form, thayin, not the plural form. Note also that the scroll describes the pool as having a smaller reservoir. One presumes it has a smaller reservoir because it also has a larger reservoir, which would mean the pool of Bethesda is not one pool, but actually two pools, which is precisely what the Hebrew of the copper scroll translated means. Beit, house, Eshdathayin, of the twin pools. In their excavations in the 1960s, a Roman Catholic monastic group known as the White Fathers actually uncovered twin pools, surrounded by covered porches. Two pools, not pentagonal in shape, but rectangular in shape. A larger pool to the south, a smaller pool to the north, separated by a dike of stone nearly 20 feet wide. So you had a large pool and a small pool with a dike, a 20-foot wide stone dike in between. The pools were situated in a small valley that's now been filled in, which ran diagonally from the western part of the city across the northern part of the old fortress of Antonia, diagonally towards the Kidron Valley. The purpose of the pools was obvious. Rain runoff, water running off from the northern part of the old city would go through this little valley and collect in these twin reservoirs, these twin pools, and then the water could be used for various purposes. The pools may also have been supplied, now we discover, by a spring, which intermittently bubbled up to the surface, which could account for the legend of the angel who came down and troubled the waters, to which some manuscripts of the 5th chapter of the Gospel of John refer. Excavations have revealed numerous capitals and columns and bases, indicating that the pools were surrounded by 5 colonnaded porches, one around the perimeter of the pools, what that is to say, one on each of the 4 sides, and then one running through the middle on that 20-foot stone dike, just as John described. And so what the White Fathers found near the fortress of Antonia on the north part of the city was exactly what John described. Rather, however, it wasn't a pentagonal-shaped pool. That was just our own bias. That was our own assumption, which we brought to the text. Rather, what we found was a rectangular-shaped pool comprised of 2 pools, a larger one and a smaller one, with a dike bisecting the 2 pools. Around the perimeter of that rectangular pool was a porch, and then there was another porch on the dike in between. So indeed, you did have 5 porches. They just weren't shaped like a pentagon. They were shaped like a rectangle. But John's description was exactly what we discovered. And so archaeology has helped us to vindicate that the Gospel of John was authentic, historically reliable, and just as credible and trustworthy as the tradition which underlies the 4th Gospel, or rather which underlies the Synoptic Gospel. So it's an example of how biblical archaeology, even though it's not a literary source, even though it's not literature, is a very, very important source in helping us to recover the history of the intertestamental period.